Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of this show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and I'm proud of it. Nothing I'm about to say has been reviewed by my agency or any other agency of the federal government, and none of this material has been reviewed or approved by a public affairs officer. And the reason is, even I don't know what I'm about to say. Uh, I'm going to talk about a couple things. I think the most important thing that's gone on as far as the federal workers are concerned the last week is that the Republicans have submitted their own version of the 1997 budget. Back in February, the Clinton administration, as they're supposed to do, even during the whole budget crisis and the negotiations and so on and so forth after two shutdowns, had placed into the Congress's hands the 1997 budget on time and when they're supposed to. And right now the Republicans have come back with their own version. And in their version, they basically reduced total spending for the next 6 years, or for the 97 budget and on to 2002, cuts of $592 billion over a period of the 6 years, and it goes into balance as far as the Congressional Budget Office is concerned in the year 2002. And Clinton, his budget that as of April 1996, that he submitted cuts the budget by $530 billion from what had been projected, and also goes into balance by the year 2002 according to the strict requirements of the Congressional Budget Office. And of course these are much, much less than the original Republican budget that was put through back around a little after October that cut over $1 trillion, and they found all kinds of things. The inflation rate is better, and various things that meant that they didn't need to cut quite as much as they otherwise might have. Plus the 1996 budget, mostly because of the shutdowns, the continuing resolutions, and everything else, are $20 billion already below projections from where they were, and the net budget deficit's about $144 billion, which is less than half what it was when Clinton first took office. I think the last year of the Bush administration was about $290 billion. So Clinton really has achieved his aim and his promise of cutting the deficit by half. He never promised to balance the budget, and he didn't. And it's not as easy as it looks. One of the reasons it's not as easy as it looks is the congressional budget, the actual federal budget. It's not set up like your budget at home when you balance your checkbook, or the budget of a business. It's set up in quite a different way. In fact, it's as if you decided to do all of your transactions in cash. So instead of making a car payment, and your car payment of $300 a month is within your budget, and you budget for your $300 a month, and therefore you're in balance, the way the federal budget is set up, you got to buy that car in cash. So you got to have $20,000 in your budget, and in your savings account if you want to buy a car, or $110,000 if you want to buy a house. Whereas you were allowed to incur debt, basically. The way the federal budget goes in, if you borrow money and to buy a car, that goes onto your deficit instead of into your cash flow. So just the way that all the politicians come up there and say, we have to balance our budget just the way you folks do out at home who have to balance their checkbook at the end of the month. Well, the federal government has to balance their checkbook as if they have money for everything, cash money for every single thing. If you want to be in balance, you have to have incurred no new debt at all for an entire year. And of course, that's different from the way businesses are set up. Now, businesses are set up so that if they buy a capital good, in other words, let's say they buy a machine that, or they buy a car, for instance, the life of that car can be depreciated over a period of years. So what they do is they capitalize. They say, I've put out $20,000 for that car, but I can expense so many thousands of dollars per year in depreciation. So they don't have to. They can borrow money. They can amortize debt. And the state governments amortize debt too, but not the federal government the way that's put out. So if the federal government has to balance the budget, that's really not an easy thing. And that they're really, if they balance the budget the way state governments do or the way businesses do, there would actually be a debt out there. Now, what debt would there be? Well, everything that's really a capital budget. The military construction budget, for instance, that could be amortized if they were on a accrual basis, if they weren't on the basis that there are. Building dams, improving the roads, building the space shuttle, buying certain kinds of weapons, all these different things would be considered capital expenditures in any other position. Now, things that are definitely expenses, I mean, you shouldn't be able to borrow if you're going to go out there and pay somebody's medical bills for Medicare, or if you're going to give somebody a Social Security check. That's an expense. And I agree that that is an expense. But there are certain capital expenses out there that really could be expensed and that really shouldn't be paid for in cash, and you should be allowed to go into debt in order to buy them without being, quote, increasing the national debt. I mean, you're actually getting assets for these things in return for the money that's going out. But the implication there is that the government's getting nothing for them. So it's a completely different setup when they say, I'm going to balance the budget. So in fact, when the government goes out there and says by the year 2002, we're going to balance the budget, they're actually putting away and probably $80 billion that would otherwise be expensed if they were a state government. And instead they have to show that, and they have to actually buy that, and they have to buy that and not borrow for it in the current year. So that's a little different. So the Republicans have really moderated their position from their budget from last year when they were accused of being quite extreme. They shut the government down twice. And what have they done? Well, the tax cut. The tax cut that started at $245 billion last year and was really actually thought to be much more because they were cutting the earned income tax credit to cover it. So it was more like $285 billion, almost $300 billion. That they're only showing a $122 billion tax cut. And what is that tax cut? That tax cut is just the $500 a child family tax cut. That's the only thing they're putting forward this particular year. They say that they might, come up with a capital gains or something else, but they didn't really put it in this proposal. And Kasich, who's the budget chairman of the House, says, well, we might close some loopholes over here and put in an increased capital gains tax. And I would be for that. That's what they should do. It should be a tax shift, not just a straight tax cut. But they were so afraid and so stung by the Democratic tax on them that they were cutting taxes for the rich and cutting services for the poor and for the middle class, that now they've come out there and they've just come up with the family tax cut and nothing else. And that tax cut is for families with incomes of $110,000 or down. And of course, the amount of that tax credit, how much good it does for you varies on what your income is. So if your income is very low, you don't really pay that much taxes anyway, so the credit doesn't really help you very much. But if your income is $110,000, that's going to be pretty considerable. You'll probably see that $500 tax credit. If your taxes are less than $500, if you only pay a net of $300 in taxes after your deductions or whatever, then you really wouldn't see it. Now, Clinton has a completely different approach. He's only going to cut taxes by $97 billion, and his tax cut's the same kind of family tax cut. But he offsets it with tax increases or closing loopholes, as he calls it, against certain businesses and industries. But the most notable is a $36 billion loophole that opened up during the crisis. And that loophole basically was a ticket tax for air travelers that basically expired. So $36 billion from last year weren't even collected that had been on the books, and he's going to put them back on the books and balance out his tax cut with that. So really the net tax cut, the amount of money that's going to be put back into the economy, according to the Clinton plan, comes to only $6 billion, which of course is not that much. But at least he's closing some loopholes, and he's offering some money back to the middle class, as are the Republicans. So really, I know that the same kind of propaganda is going to come up in the following year, that the Republicans are cutting services to the poor, which their plan does, but that they're giving it all to the rich. That's not really true this round, unless the Republicans change from this particular proposal. But right now, this proposal is limited just to the $500 per child tax cut. Now, who doesn't that help? It obviously doesn't help any elderly people, and it doesn't help childless couples. It only helps couples that are relatively middle class and upper middle class that actually pay a net of $500 per child, who can get their tax credit back. So that's going to be right there. Medicare, they're really pretty close. The Republicans are cutting $158 billion. The Democrats, $116 billion. What's the big difference? The big difference is going to be the medical savings account, which is an account that allows a healthy and wealthy person to set up a savings account. The government will let them put their employer or themselves put that money in tax-free, and then they can get a catastrophic insurance plan. What's the problem with that? Problem with that is that the minute you get sick, you're going to switch out of it. So it really gives the companies that offer these catastrophic insurance policies a chance to cherry pick only the healthiest people, and to encourage them to cherry pick themselves. And of course, the Democrats argue that that's going to reduce the universe of people and increase the average Medicare payment for all the sicker and poorer people that can't really afford this program. And I agree with that. I don't think the MSAs are a very good idea. And of course, that's being kicked around in a current gridlocked medical insurance proposal that's been going around. Medicaid, Clinton's cutting $54 billion. Republicans are cutting $72 billion, but of course the Republicans are going to shut it down completely for all intents and purposes, provide block grants to the states, so they're back on that thing, and bring Medicaid back to the states and the people. At least that's the way they put it. Welfare, the Republicans are cutting $53 billion, and I'm not sure whether the cuts in the earned income tax credit are part of that, because I understand that those are still on there. And the Democrats are only cutting $38 billion, which is still a pretty big cut. And the net discretionary spending cuts are $266 billion over 6 years for Clinton and $345 billion for the Republicans. Hefty amounts. Now, one thing I haven't understood all along is why the Republicans just don't call Clinton's bluff. Because if he actually signed and had to sign the balanced budget that he himself has put forward, he'd be slitting his throat with a lot of different liberal and Democratic interest groups. So it seems to me that the Republicans have really set themselves up for a fall by giving Clinton the chance to say, look, I put forward a balanced budget, but those Republicans threw in poison pills and they won't agree with me. They won't do these things. And there's been a bunch of other things going on in Congress. A lot of controversy over the higher gas prices, and the Republicans have offered to cut the gas tax by 4.3 cents per gallon, which would cut the current year. It ends at the end of the year about $3 to $5 billion of revenue. Clinton says, I'll sign it. And of course, then there's the minimum wage. We've talked about the minimum wage before, and the Republicans say we'll put it on the docket, and of course Clinton says we're all for you. Democrats will vote for it, and I'll sign it. The catch to the whole thing is he wanted to add another item to that particular bill, and that bill he calls the TEAM Act, or Dole calls the TEAM Act. And what the TEAM Act is, it says basically right now the labor law says if you have a union in your plant, you have to do collective bargaining with your union. TEAM Act would allow the company to team together, total quality management with their employees, basically to appoint a team of employees to negotiate with, and then negotiate conditions of employment with those people, bypassing the union. Of course, unions are dead set against it, and Dole is saying, well, I'm going to stick it to the unions who've raised $35 million to run against kind of independent campaigns against Republican congressmen and senators. And I'm not sure that's that good a strategy. We'll find out, see whether he wins or loses on the basis of that particular strategy. Then the other thing that's going on is there's a big change in the way the housing is being done. That, of course, is all jogged up and gridlock as well. But what they want to do is to basically privatize a lot of this federal HUD, housing for the poor, and to replace it with vouchers so that poor people can go and live wherever they want to. And also for the housing that remains, they'll increase the amount of rent higher than 30% of the salary or the net income of the people that live there, which of course would drive some of the poorer people out, but also to allow people up to 80% of the median income in that area to move into the federal housing. And that, of course, would squeeze some of the poor people. But it would, on the other hand, create a mix of people, so maybe that middle-class people can rub shoulders with the poor people and vice versa, and people can live in an area that's not just exclusively segregated just for the poorest of the poor. I've been thinking about how I feel about these things. I really haven't made a decision on which is best personally. Not that I have, not that anybody cares what my opinion is, and I'm sure I'm going to talk about it further once I decide whether the goal of getting different kinds of people to live together is as important as making sure that the poorest people in our society are housed at all, because housing is a terrible problem in our society. And of course, the reason that federal housing got involved, interfering with the market and so on and so forth, is because the market wasn't really housing and providing affordable housing for the poor. The wealthier people were moving out of town and going to the suburbs, and that left these small areas that were left. Zoning was created that made it very, very difficult to build any affordable housing out in the suburbs. So affordable housing was just drying up. It was only left in the worst parts of the inner city. And of course, the government stepped in between the 30s and the 70s, built a lot of high-rise housing that's just become a nightmare. Some of which has become a nightmare. Some not so bad, but some really pretty awful, and places that are pretty horrific and not very safe. So we'll see how that comes out. I wanted to talk about another issue that came up, and I don't have the articles in front of me, and I can't speak off of articles, but which has been coming up. And that issue is an issue that everybody kind of touches and gets their little hands burnt. That issue is affirmative action, and not so much concerned about affirmative action, but about what everybody says is what's preferable to affirmative action, that is hiring by merit. Everybody says we don't need affirmative action. All these people that are against it say we don't need affirmative action because the market will step right in and make sure that the best person, the most qualified person will always get hired. And yet people look around. They look around their companies. They look around their agencies. They look around everything. And they find that that's not really true. That the best person doesn't get hired for the job. And that they don't get really hired for the job if they feel that they're the best person. And everybody's concerned about that. And everybody's concerned about why. And that goes even more so for the entree or the entry into the best jobs and into the elite. And that, of course, is a college education. The college education is a big controversy over affirmative action in colleges and how colleges actually bring people into the system and start them off on their route toward professional life and toward membership in this elusive elite that really runs pretty much everything. And there's no doubt about it. If you've graduate of Harvard Business School, you have a lot better chance of becoming a great success and becoming a CEO or president of a large, major company than you do if you're not a graduate of Harvard Business School. And there were a couple articles that had come up that I can talk about from my memory that really were pretty interesting in this way. Now, to put a little background in it, there's been a very, very important Supreme Court ruling. Uh, Everybody refers to it as Adarand. I forgot who was Adarand versus who. But the Adarand decision basically said that you cannot have, or you can only have preferences based on race if there's a absolutely substantial national requirement for it, and that there would be strict scrutiny by the courts for anybody in any agency or any operation that basically says that this is necessary. Otherwise, it's a violation of the 14th Amendment, which says, which is for equal rights and equal treatment for every citizen, no matter, regardless of race, creed, color, sex, gender, or anything else. And basically, that's what it does. And so there's a big controversy over what does Adarand mean? What is the court trying to say? And the courts basically come in and says that there's strict scrutiny and there has to be an absolutely necessary state requirement. And, well, what is it? Is diversity this absolutely necessary requirement? Is it absolutely necessary for the survival of our country? And some people say yes, and other people say no. And of course, the Adarand decision was not about hiring, it wasn't about admissions into college. What it was actually about was the minority preference for awarding government contracts. I believe it was a state contract that was at issue there. And basically they gave the contract to a minority-owned firm, and the guy who competed for it felt that he was more qualified, and he brought suit that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the thing that gets to me is there really, I mean, I don't have a problem with affirmative action myself, and I think that the American people are very, very divided on that. Polls have said that people are against racial preferences or quotas, but they're for outreach. In other words, they don't consider that it's either fair or legal for a company to go out there and outreach to the local golf course and golf club and pick the most qualified employee who's a member of the CEO's golf club. And people don't like that, and people don't feel that it's fits the requirement to go out there and put out a job announcement at the local very, very highly expensive and exclusive private prep school and say, you know, we would like to recruit students only from this prep school to go to such and such a college, and that colleges aren't doing their duty. They want to make sure, and people don't have a problem with putting out sending a recruiter to the most prestigious black college in the South or inner city high school or so on and so forth, as well as to a prep school, and that to recruit only from the universe of just the prep schools and golf clubs is not considered acceptable, and the American people don't really like that. But the Adarand decision says that there has to be a pressing reason, and other than that, the court is going to use strict scrutiny and really look very, very hard to make sure that any affirmative action program doesn't discriminate or reverse discriminate and discriminate against whites. And that's basically the situation that's on right now. Now, I'm not going to be able to get into it as much as I should, but the alternative is an absolute strict meritocracy. And what is a meritocracy? That means that only the person who passes the test and gets the highest grade can get into the best school at all. Only the person with absolutely the highest marks and the highest qualifications can get considered for a job. And of course, that means you can't hire your cousin, and you can't hire your nephew, can't hire the person that you've known all your life and that you trust the most, and so on and so forth. And I think that most people realize, if they just look around them, that this isn't how the system works now, and that there are preferences. There are preferences for people who management knows and trusts, and there are preferences at present under affirmative action for minorities as well. Now, I'm not sure you can get rid of that without getting rid of the preferences for people that are trusted. My name is Reed Silverne. The name of the show is Fed Pride. And the reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and I'm proud of it. Thank you very much, and I'll be on next week.